My name's Andi Baritchi. I'm a director in the cybersecurity services group at KPMG. To my left, we've got Joel Rader, a senior solutions architect at Radiant Logic. Karl McGuinness, a senior director of identity at Okta. We got Laura Hunter, a principal program manager at Microsoft. And we've got John Bradley, a senior technical architect at Ping Identity. So some of the world's smartest folks when it comes to the intersection of identity and cybersecurity. And we're just going to talk about, what's been going on in the field of identity management over the past decade, and what do we think's going to go on, everything from challenges to opportunities and so forth over the next decade. So first, let's talk about some buzzwords. Just to start, there's a number of words that everybody in the identity ecosystem has been using over the past decade that they're still relevant, but they're not at the forefront anymore. Words like trust, authentication and authorization, single sign-on, multi-factor authentication, source of truth, and federation. So those are all topics we've all beaten to death, talked about. They're not exciting topics anymore to many of us, but let's talk about some newer buzzwords and things that may end up being disruptors for cyber and for identity in the coming years. So maybe some of these will ring true to those of you in the audience and my panel members. The cloud, the fog, Internet of Things or IoT, your identity versus your persona. And in fact, Edward Snowden talked about that just a little bit ago. Each of us has a number of different personas, be it our work persona, or if we're a sports coach, or who we are in our family lives and so forth. And each one of those personas, we get to choose how much we want them to intersect or not. BYOD, bring your own device. And finally, the vanishing perimeter, the biggest one for many of us. So with that, let's start with a few panel questions, and then we'll go around the audience to see if y'all have questions you'd like to pose to our panel. So the first one, what would you say is the biggest challenge over the past 5 to 10 years that identity management has risen up to? So whoever wants to go first.
Yeah, I think in large part, one of the biggest challenges is that we understand now that we need security, we need identity, we need privacy, and all those technologies to interact. And I think kind of the next challenge is going to be how do we figure out what's actually going to work, what's functional, what's not just theoretically available, what is practical and available for individuals and companies to adopt that actually enhance security and privacy.
I think deployability, usability, and adoption, sort of those three terms sort of connect. I think a lot of investments have been made over the years in sort of purchasing solutions for security, but they haven't necessarily been reached critical adoption for either from the users or from the business, primarily whether it is a economic challenge, a user challenge. I think with the cloud and the consumerization of IT, I think there's new opportunities to really sort of reapproach maybe some of those decisions and get a lot more value for the business.
I think we've definitely risen to the challenge, to the reality that hybrid isn't just a cute way of saying, well, you'll be in the cloud soon, so let's forget about all of your on-prem assets and all of your on-prem infrastructure. I think there's been a growing understanding across the industry that even for companies, even for customers where we're very much pushing towards that cloud play, we do still need to take into account, whether it's from a security standpoint, from a usability standpoint, that we need to meet our customers, we need to meet our partners and our users, we need to meet these people where they are, not just where we would like them to be. And in many cases that includes accepting the fact that there is this 20-year legacy of on-prem investment that is not just coming along for the ride, but is still relevant and still needs to and deserves to be secure and usable and meaningful.
I think over the last 5 years, we've made some progress around point solutions. I don't think that we've necessarily done a good job at having sort of holistic architectures. People tend to have been a bit more reactive, and I hope more planning in the future. I think we've done actually a pretty good job of bringing forward standards for interoperability. I also think that some of the old buzzwords are going to become new buzzwords again, because one of your old buzzwords was federation. We now have more people becoming federations who weren't traditionally federation operators. The GSMA is setting up an identity federation across all the telcos across the world for millions of relying parties. We have the banks under PSD2 who are becoming federation operators. So while we did have things that we thought of as federations before, those things are now expanding to be 100,000 times larger than we had in the past.
Didn't we decide over dinner last night that every year for the last 15 years has been the year of PKI?
Yeah, I was part of the
Yes,
group
we
that
did.
decided that 15 years ago. So.
But I think that just speaks to the challenge, right? The core challenge being scale, the scale of the number of applications, the number of devices, the number of use cases. And so the old terms becoming new again is really just the technologies chosen at the time, and potentially the way they were deployed were maybe limited to specific use cases. And now it's coming of age for the broader set of scenarios that they were promised for.
So y'all mentioned that lots of folks try to implement something, but it's not always fully baked or fully used. That's certainly something we see very often in the cybersecurity world, and identity is no exception. I coined the term blinking light syndrome for it. When an organization spends a lot of money on this awesome tool, awesome product, awesome piece of software, and then you go in, so how does it work, and who's managing it, and who's tuning it? Oh, well, they left the company 6 months ago, so nobody really. So I know that's one particular challenge for identity, but what else would you say over the past 5 or 10 years maybe the identity industry has struggled with, and what lessons have we learned, that one in addition to the one I just mentioned?
I think a lot of times, we're good at figuring out, okay, we want to secure our logical resources, but physical resources are, in large part not modernized along with everything else. So I've seen that in, quite a few organizations where that's treated like a completely different set of individuals. You usually have security officers, a police force securing that, not IT individuals, and they don't communicate back and forth. But to me, that's a huge growth potential, because now you have people coming into physical buildings, then accessing resources, and not everything is done remotely. Some things are still done. Some of the most important things are done, on site. And that's an area where I've not seen a lot of growth, but I think there absolutely could be. So some of the same, kind of, nomenclature and terms that are used on the logical access side could apply to the physical access. Federation, multi-factor authentication, and it's sometimes treated where there's not an intelligence to be gathered from all that activity, but I think there is in large part.
Absolutely good point. And any other areas where y'all would say we've struggled as an industry?
I think MFA is a great example. I think companies deployed lots of different hard tokens over the years to try to implement strong authentication. Didn't have the correct properties maybe from a usability perspective and from a cost perspective. Maybe it was limited to just privileged account users. Now with always online systems and password breaches and the reality that a password is really just not enough, being able to leverage the smartphone and the supercomputer in pockets, the hardware, the standards like FIDO that are coming through to the browsers, really getting to sort of critical mass now where strong authentication is easy and cheap, I think is sort of a lot of lessons learned through PKI to now on different solutions that I think is interesting time right now.
I think that usability has been an ongoing challenge, an ongoing struggle. Having said that, I would say that as an industry, we might be being too hard on ourselves, because in many ways, especially the folks in this room, we are dealing with the very leading edge of the technologies that we're developing. And what is the product management lifecycle? First, you make it work. Then you make it fast. Then you make it scale. Then you make it easy. In some ways, and in a lot of the technologies we're dealing with, we're still at number one. Having said that, if we want to solve these challenges, if we want to solve for scale, if we want to solve for adoption, we do need to make it easy, or at least easier. We need to the extent possible, we need to take the human out of the equation. Look at everything that's being posted on your Facebook wall from your grandma and your aunt this morning about the ransomware attacks. Well, just don't click on any suspicious links in your email. Come on, really? We need to find a way to make our customers, our ecosystem, as secure as possible in a way that is easy enough for the masses to don't make me think stupid. We're not there yet. We need to get there.
Right. So I think people have deployed things that are still in the just make it work category. A lot of things I've seen, like EMM deployments, where people spend ungodly amounts of money. Not looking at any EMM vendors on here who have fine products.
I'd like dive behind
no.
the thing.
At least you're not charging ungodly amounts of money for it. And I think people like Microsoft with Intune and others, the next stage is actually making it work with other things. I talk to a lot of customers, et cetera, who say, well, how do I know that that federated login is coming from a device that I've managed? Which on the face of it seems like a completely reasonable and rational question to want to know. And very few people can actually do that. So actually having these things that we think of as, that we spend a lot of money on as discrete silos, we have to actually have the infrastructure and standards to get them to work together. So federation and EMM need to actually come together to give you the value that you thought you were getting in the first place.
I think it's interesting that, in the EMM example, it was sort of, the smartphone platforms were consumer first. And so the vendors invested a lot for the consumer features and then sort of realized they needed adoption for the enterprise, and so they built enterprise out. Whereas a lot of the technologies we started off discussing were started in the enterprise and then tried to push down to consumer. So I think it's kind of interesting that the platforms are kind of shifting at that point, where some of the challenges that you're describing are something that we in the identity industry would say would be a V1 requirement. Yet they started off in a much more consumer, got broad adoption, phones got into the enterprise. Then now the next question is, now how do we solve those higher level problems?
Right, and there's even the question of, is EMM from the top down even the right approach, or should we be trying to manage from the applications up? So there's different perspectives depending upon whether you're coming from it from an identity point of view or a device management point of view.
So before we go to the next question, Laura, you gave us the steps to creation of any product. Did anybody hear security as one of those steps? Make it secure. I think that's just goes to show you that it should be. I know we're talking about creating a security thing, so maybe it's not maybe it's implicitly in there, but I think that's certainly a root cause of a lot of our problems. Is first people try to make it work, then they do all the other things and the stuff to make it scale and so forth. And security is like, oh, that's like step 6. Let's secure the thing. With that, I want to pose the next question. What are some interesting potential disruptors that are coming on the horizon in the identity space?
I really think IoT is a big one here, because it kind of changes what you think of as identity. I mean, 10 years ago, especially in the federal space or the military space, the PIV and the CAC, that was seen as, this is your identity. It's technically a credential, but for a lot of people, the badge they wore around their neck, that was their identity. Now, that didn't apply to everyone. If you were a foreign national, if you were a contractor that was there under 6 months, you didn't get a PIV card. So in some of the security terms, it was like, well, you don't have an identity, therefore we're going to maybe reduce it down to a username and password just so you can get access, right? So it's almost like an intentional lowering of security. But with devices, IoT, identity of things, if you want to call it that, then how do you identify those devices? How securely do you identify them? How do you onboard them? How do you offboard them? So all that kind of traditional human-based identity topics kind of have an analog in the machine space, but how do you manage that? How do you maintain that moving forward? And the scale is huge, right? There's 20 billion IoT devices. So how do you make those processes work on that large of a scale? Is there a one-size-fits-all? Probably not.
That's a really good point. And with all these different IoT devices, some of them certainly pose a lot more potential for harm than others. We think about drones. We hear about weaponized drones. We've got the era of self-driving cars coming. We're going to have cars talking to each other. We're going to have cars talking to the road. How does the road identify itself to the car to tell the car that it's closed? And how do we know that that's really the road and not just somebody who decided to shut down the road for him or herself to have an easier commute? But any other examples of interesting disruption?
Well, just to mention off of what you just talked about, I still think, back to the joke about PKI, I still think key management still a problem. How to do key management at scale. So a lot of the problems you're talking about, baking secrets in, whether it's from a DevOps or IoT, just solving key management at scale has been a challenge, right? And so we have new primitives, we have cloud-based primitives that we can leverage to help try to solve some of these problems. We have new technology stacks such as distributed ledgers and blockchains, but at the end of the day, we haven't really gotten key management down yet, and it hasn't become frictionless for a developer or a product manager just to leverage, integrate into an enterprise, integrate into an end user scenario, and that creates some of the challenges that you described with revocation, issuance, all these same problems, right? And we just keep moving from one stack to the next stack and solving those. So I think that's an open problem still to solve, but I also just to think that cloud and BYOD still isn't done yet from a disruption perspective. I still think that's just getting started. I think that we're still in the early days of what's going to happen with BYOD and cloud, changing our methodologies about how we think about security from perimeters to perimeterless to understanding the app to understanding the device. Your identity system is not just the user or the factor, but it's the device context, the app context. Having all that context and decision making at sort of a risk level is an interesting sort of, we're ready now, we have the technology. It's going to do a lot of, I think, interesting more stuff than I don't think we're going to be talking about it next year still.
All right. So you want.
Yeah, I think from a disruption standpoint, kind of going along with cloud, going along with BYOD, is this idea of this incredible amount of data, this big data, and these machine learning capabilities that come along with these other disruptions. And there's the pessimist view of the world, which is where we can think of it as, oh my God, Skynet next week. I'm a big Terminator fan, so Skynet comes up in my presentations a lot. But we can also think of it as a way to move the ball forward from a security perspective, because we're starting to have the ability to make determinations and to make decisions like, I'm seeing this suspicious executable that's running on one VM in one Azure or AWS customer's subscription. Well, now let me look at the entirety of the Azure or AWS ecosystem. How many different customers have reported this executable? How many of them say that it's malware? And so at that point, you're not just getting the benefit of anti-malware, as an example, deployed at your micro subscription level. You're getting the benefit of platform-wide and sometimes cross-platform machine intelligence that can help to secure an environment. And I think that that's going to be a big area of investment moving forward.
So going forward, it's not just the identity of the person or the identity of the device, and sometimes that gets conflated in certain circumstances, or people want to make it simpler and conflate the two. But really, you have to know the identity of the individual, the identity of the device, and the identity of the app in some deterministic way. And that, again, devolves into what's probably a key management problem. We have people who still keep symmetric keys or their private RSA key pairs in their GitHub repository along with their source code. And that is the cause of a distressing number of breaks. I can see people snickering in the audience because you know who I'm talking about. But there's many of them. It's not just a couple. So, people have to, HSM's not sexy. Everyone should use them. Go out, get an HSM, secure your keys, etc. And cloud vendors have to do a better job of supporting, protecting people's keys. We have Let's Encrypt and other things that are making inroads, but still it comes back. A lot of using these things securely comes back to the underlying unsexy thing of how do you manage your keys, how do you do account recovery, etc. If it all falls back to, oh, yes, we have a completely secure system, but all you need to do is press a button and you'll get an email to your password-protected Google account to recover all of your keys and reestablish all of your crypto tokens. Attackers are just going to go after the easiest spot, and it's account recovery and some of those other things that can be socially engineered.
I think Let's Encrypt, I don't know if everybody knows Let's Encrypt. I think that's a great example of taking something that was high friction for any company, issuing and deploying SSL certificates, that's basic security, that's a mandatory in today's world, killing HTTP, and turning it into something that's completely automated, something that's completely, it just automates, deploys the certs, installs it, renews it, no friction whatsoever. That's a great example of the kinds of technologies that we need to take for these really complex problems that we've been managing for a while, and I'd love to see those patterns keep going down the stack and applying it to more.
So I think what I'm hearing from y'all, the main themes all seem very cybersecurity 101, just basic hygiene. Know which identities matter to us. It started as identity of people. It's, now with IoT, it's becoming the identity of things, identities of all the things, be it a sensor on a self-driving car, the self-driving car itself, or the entire ecosystem. I heard information sharing. I heard, in addition to information sharing, not knowing where your keys are. I mean, that's again cybersecurity 101, not storing your private key in the wrong place. And the hackers are always going to go for the weakest link, so we should as well when we're reviewing our own defenses. In addition to those, if we want to switch gears and talk about quick wins, what can we as an industry, as identity professionals, do to protect the identity of people, the identity of things, as we start transitioning to this new world?
I think it's where you can step back and then do take a look at kind of the holistic enterprise architecture of what it is you're doing. Because especially in the identity space, there is no by identity management 101, install, deploy, you're done, right? It's usually a collection of products. So you always have to look at where does my piece of software interact with other pieces of software or tools or technologies, and kind of what are those boundaries. So take a look at that from the 50,000-foot view and say, where are the kind of the weak links? Instead of focusing on just your piece of the puzzle, take a little bit broader scope. The challenge with that, especially having worked in the federal space, is that you're given a task of requirements. You do these things and only these things. If you step outside that box, now you're stepping on someone else's toes and you'll get rocks thrown at you, right? And it's not fun. So having sat in that space, the push is to just do what you're supposed to do, and it's somebody else's job to worry about that. But at the same time, that's not really a good model to follow because things get missed that way. And it's easy to overlook it, and I don't think you can do that. So stop, just take a breather and look at what's going on and try and figure out, is this really the pathway we should follow? If that's not, then how do we step back? And sometimes that's a leadership problem. And I don't know if that is necessarily a technology problem, but I think leadership does need to address that sometimes. Where do we need to be effective when it comes to improving and enhancing security and usability?
Including the whole where you're never really done, and communicating that up to the board level of this is a journey and it's something we've got to do on an ongoing basis, right?
Agreed.
Just to, meat and potatoes, hopefully everybody in this room is deployed SSO. Every employee is using SSO. All your privileged account administrators are using MFA, and hopefully you're starting to think about temporary ephemeral access for your administrators. Like, just meat and potatoes. That's the quickest win you're going to get for security in your enterprise today. If that's not where you're at, think about that just being level 1. Get there, and then start thinking about the next level challenges.
So I actually think we are being served, and served well, by the fact that many of the conversations we're having are still Security 101. Today's symmetric key stored in a GitHub repo is 5 years ago's password stored in a text file on an SMB share. The problems haven't changed. The implementation of them has changed, and now they are occurring at cloud scale, and everything is harder at cloud scale. But when we think about how we communicate at a leadership level, in many ways, these problems haven't changed. There's a really great book called How to Break Software, and it breaks down, so to speak, every problem that can occur in a piece of software into 17 use cases. Knock out these 17 use cases, and you are done. Doesn't matter what vertical you're in, doesn't matter what language you're coding in. And then if we take that that software development metaphor and apply it to the security landscape, because every single one of us is a consultant. We are either consulting with external customers or we are consulting with our own internal organizations. We need to be able to have those leadership conversations where we can explain and we can help to evangelize the idea that these are not new problems. They still need to be solved, and some of them need to be solved using a different checklist, but these are still valid problems that need to be solved. And here's how Mr. 20-year CISO, who is perhaps still afraid of the cloud, I can give you the analogy that allows you to see, oh, this is the problem space I've been dealing with my whole life, just with a new checklist.
Yeah, I wish that we could get to the 102 class. The problem tends to be that while we did a good job of educating, we may have done a good job of educating the SOAP developers, some number of years ago. Those aren't the people that are writing the cool new apps. They're all, REST guys, and they care about how to do their REST APIs and may not actually care about security. So it seems like every few years we have to go through the education cycle again. The details. Not so many people are using COBOL anymore. Sorry for those of you that are, our banking friends. But some of the ground may change, but unless we keep educating people on the basic principles, we're not going to make too much progress. There are things that we're doing to try and add stuff to the underlying plumbing. So Let's Encrypt is a good example. We're moving ahead with token binding and other things which are just becoming part of the stack. So people will be able to inherit better security properties without necessarily having to think about it. So the more things that we can automate and make it natural for them to fit in, and less explaining we do, the less likely it is for them to make mistakes. But they're creative. They'll always find new ways of making mistakes.
So just for those of y'all in the audience that might have a question, we're about at the 80% mark. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and head over to that microphone as we're getting close to wrapping up. And we'd love to hear from y'all with questions that y'all might have. I guess I'll go with really what's my finishing question. With the convergence that we're seeing of all these different buzzwords, of the vanishing perimeter, the cloud, the fog, IoT, bring your own device, different personas, omni-channel marketing, and all these different things, what are the biggest challenges for us as an industry and the biggest opportunities to make a difference from the identity management industry all the way up to cybersecurity to business enablement and so forth?
I think scalability is a big one. Scalability and flexibility, especially in the security space, trying to find like the magic padlock that will, if you have the magic padlock, everything is secure, but that doesn't exist, or even if it does, it might only work for a narrow band. That doesn't mean it's not useful. So I'm kind of thinking PIV and CAC again, right? I mean, very useful doesn't necessarily apply 100%, and having it doesn't mean that you're secure. Is it good? Yes, in certain use cases, but are there other things that you could adopt as well to kind of expand that? I think John's comment last night was about moving the attack surface. So if everything over here is really secure, but everything over here is not, where do the bad guys go, right? So scalability and flexibility, how do you then incorporate that other, let's say, more now inviting attack surface? How do you address that? Scalability and flexibility, more people, more devices.
Laura, that reminds me of the comment you just made that the problems aren't changing, they just look different.
Yes, very much so. And I think if we look at the opportunities that we have to make a difference as an industry, I think it just goes back to everything we've been talking about all morning. We want to make things scalable. We want to make things adoptable. We want to use standards to make that happen. And from my perspective, I'm a big believer in the convergence of security and usability. I mean, you think of the old trope of there's the analog dial and security is on one side and usability is on the other, and if you dial one up, you need to dial the other one down. I think we are at a place as an industry where we have the technology that will allow us to raise both. I think we should be looking for opportunities to increase the security of our systems by making them more usable, make them standards-based, make them more automated. Don't make that developer think about token bindings because I assert that he or she maybe shouldn't have to. It should just be baked into the plumbing.
I just echo, it's focusing on sort of those key results and time to value. So changing the problem statement from it's just security or it's just usability, but adoption, back to my opening comment, like adoption is a big part of it. So if your key business metric is how successfully was I able to roll out this new technology across every user, how easy was I able to respond to this particular new patch or threat, those I think will be the key drivers for the business that will help address, I think, some of the challenges.
Right. So I agree that, the security versus usability is a false trade-off, and I think we are making progress with things like web authentication / FIDO2, where we have the security of a PIV card, but it's actually useful for logging in online, which PIV cards, I used to work for the GSA for a while. They don't necessarily live up to their full potential in the real world. I don't know that there's a nicer way of putting that. But we've had solutions that secure particular parts of the problem. I think we have to address account recovery. Generating strong credentials that can't be phished, because phishing is becoming an increasing part of the various attacks. Even OTPs and TAN cards and other things are easily phishable these days. So what you have for multi-factor security may not actually protect you against phishing. Your mileage may vary, and vendors aren't necessarily going to tell you if they're deficient in particular ways. And there's combinations of mitigations that you can do to get at it. But we have to put all of this stuff together and sort of plug some of the holes, because some of the things that need to be done aren't necessarily the sexy solutions that us vendors want to sell you. Some of them are just the meat and potatoes stuff.
All right. Well, I guess I see we've got a couple folks out at the microphone. Please go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us your question.
Sure. It's Javier Flores. I'm with Fannie Mae. Been doing identity and access management for over 10 years. A lot of the things you guys said resonate with me. There's standard problems we're running into from an organization perspective. And you guys have touched on a few things on how do we ensure that we kind of get to that one-on-one and make sure that we got the meat and potatoes covered. But what we find often happening is that prioritizations shift. There is a focus at some point in time we're redoing identity and access management because of a finding that we got from SOX, and all this money is funneled to it. But it's like everyone says, it stops. There's this one point in time and it stops, and management doesn't get that this is a journey. And then for us to be successful, we have to continue with that journey. I'm curious to know your opinions as to how do we get that conversation going again? How do we make sure that management stops looking at the nice shiny objects that come up every year, and let's continue to focus on the journey that we have with identity and access management, and make sure that the money is appropriated correctly to that initiative. Thanks.
So Javier, thank you for the question. I think one of the key messages we espouse at my firm is, instead of waiting for cyber fatigue at the board level to hit you, address it head on when you're addressing the board, and talk about, yes, we understand that as cybersecurity professionals, we're always asking for this much budget. It's usually growing. And certainly when you're the defenders, there is a challenge in showing, well, here's the things that didn't happen because of the budget. But if you actually address it head on and talk about here's the risk that could happen, here's the risk to the business, and make it a business risk conversation instead of a security reactionary IT audit driven conversation, in our experience, in our clients' experience, that works better. Does anybody want to chime in? And
so business value is one way that we address it, is looking at, look at your password reset flows or whatever else going on in your company today in that area. Huge cost for productivity across a number of categories. As you look at adoption of new cloud applications or new scenarios there, how quickly can we do self-service? What are the key security technologies I need to enable self-service? So if you can align behind not just a compliance or risk-driven initiative, but also a productivity-driven initiative as well, you can potentially try to explain more business value for the ROI for the investment, and it's not just compliance. So there's a lot going on there and how to position potentially some of the investments there.
Yeah, and I would say look at investing like a lab, right, where you can deploy some of these pilot projects. So all these cybersecurity attacks are happening all the time, and they're in pilot mode all the time, every day, going after all of you, right? Do the same. There's these new products, new technologies. Sometimes they do need some refinement for your particular situation. So take some of the meat and potatoes and say, hey, let's try this out in a setting in your environment, and then see if it makes sense to roll out, system-wide, right? That's an easy win. sometimes you just need like a small lab space or something to try it out, see if it works. Have that ongoing, right? So then it's a marathon and not a sprint. Responding to, let's have a 30-day cybersecurity sprint. Band-aids don't work, right? You need some place to try some of these technologies out. Maybe they work, maybe they don't, but how do you know until you try it? And give some people, like vendors and stuff, latitude to try it sometimes. Sometimes that can be your most effective use of time, I think.
And the Band-Aids oftentimes do end up becoming blinking light syndrome. You get a lot of budget to fix one thing, you buy the fancy tool, and then nobody manages it, and the control that you bought that really expensive tool to fix falls back through the cracks. And we see that all too often.
Yeah. I think it's kind of dovetailing off of that. It is also helpful when speaking at the leadership level, when speaking at the board level, to be able to use the terminology that they are comfortable interacting with. So if we think of blinking light syndrome, if we think about how we are investing our money, use the cloud to your advantage. So one of the kind of cloud 101 benefits is I'm not putting iron on my premises. I'm not spending money on heating and cooling. I'm not, needing to have people to patch and reboot and update and blah, blah, blah. I'm still making an investment. I'm still writing a check to my cloud service provider. But it's entirely possible, depending on your organization, that falls in a different spot on the balance sheet. Is it CapEx versus OpEx? Does that make the investment more palatable based on where your organization is financially? Everyone doesn't need to hear about token bindings all the time, even though we love talking about them.
Yes, they do.
Okay, you love talking about token bindings all the time, and I respect that.
And my children tell their classmates.
All right, let's go to the next question, please.
Hi, I'm Steve Hutchinson with General Electric. A lot of when you're talking about identity in the IoT space, most of the conversations seem to be around the consumer market. A lot of stuff, when you've got your smart homes. What do you see happening in the industrial space? So some of the challenges that we've had are we've done a lot of work using human identity to restrict access to the large amount of data that's now being produced by this industrial equipment. But more and more, we're seeing use cases where GE will build a turbine and it needs to talk to a plethora of other vendors. And we don't have a good identity solution for it. We don't have a good solution for that. We focus a lot on network security. And when we first started talking about identity, everybody said, certificates. Certificates is how we'll solve this. Well, some of these pieces of industrial equipment have a 30-plus year lifespan. And I haven't seen a lot of discussion about that kind of industrial space. What do you see for those types of use cases?
So I think flexibility there, again, is really critical because PKI solves some great problems. But if you take a simple example, if you have a bunch of temperature sensors throughout a data center, you might have thousands of them. Are you going to manage the keys and the certificates on all those devices? Do you really need to if all they're doing is spitting out the temperature of a single point in the rack or something like that? So at that level, maybe not. Maybe just a proper random number generator on that device is enough to give it kind of a unique ID. But if you go up the layer to everything that those temperature sensors talk to, maybe then you do. You now have enough value on that device to start managing certificates on that. So then the issue that you present, if you've got a 30-year device, that's kind of a different layer. So what do you do for those devices that might be different? I don't know if there's a one-size-fits-all, but I think there's different layers and stacks in there. And I think PKI is a good one that can probably address part of that. Having proper random number generators on your devices, that's critical too. There's crypto chips now that can house a lot of that and do a lot of that for you. So a part of that, it's a conversation with the vendors who are producing these. How are you sourcing the proper equipment? Is your supplier chain, how is that secured? So all that kind of goes into it. So you're looking at what that device is. How do you initially generate that identifier, and then how do you secure that communication up the chain?
So the bad news is that we haven't done We haven't done sufficient standards around that, as you well know. Mostly around OAuth. We've been concentrating on consumer devices. I think that probably the next round and some of the stuff that we're doing around proof of possession, et cetera, for higher security use cases, probably over the next year or two, we'll start looking at how that can fit into industrial stuff, and we welcome your input.
So I think we're hearing again that the problems aren't changing. So everything I just heard reminds me of we haven't made it out of cybersecurity 101 yet.
Yeah,
Would that be a fair
I think a
statement?
lot of it to address that particular question. I think a lot of it comes down to realistic and pragmatic threat modeling, because there is the threat modeling exercise that becomes the political turf war. Well, of course, my thing needs to be secured as highly as anything else because that speaks to my value as an executive. Well, that's really not the right way holistically to approach that sort of model. You have to think about Jack Bauer, and you have to think about Chloe. I can't remember her last name. There's the guy who can knock the guy's head with a wrench. There's the person who can, circumvent something by way of some sort of technology hack. Both of these are valid. What points of your infrastructure are vulnerable to which?
So to summarize, there's certainly a clock speed dilemma here. We've got very disparate industries that are coming together. Of course, industrial manufacturing with, like you said, a 30-year life cycle, and software whose life cycle might be measured in months or a small number of years. So certainly, I think back to cybersecurity 101, doing that risk assessment exercise first, including that threat modeling to figure out, before we even start trying to fixing the problem, identify what is the problem? Are we trying to protect just the data coming out of those sensors? How confidential is it? Is it the confidentiality of the data we're trying to protect? Is it the integrity? Or is it a self-driving car where the availability, the uptime is the most important thing? Or is it all the above? Once we figure out what we're trying to protect, we're going to risk rank those different things. And really only then can we start trying to protect them.
Thank you.
Hi, Janice Toney, Charter Communications. It's a little too high for me, guys. Okay. So I have a question. You touched on product, and I work a lot on product development, emerging cybersecurity, and we do a lot of data Ethernet, getting out to our customers. The last thing I'm thinking about as a program manager when we're trying to get out the door, we're being pressed, make money, is security. And I do not see any security people coming down and hammering us, nor are we thinking about it when we're trying to get stuff out the door to the customer. How do you bring them together so that you get something out there that your customers aren't vulnerable? And is it a cultural change? I'm not sure how to do it because it's the last thing that's on my mind when I'm getting pressure from the VPs. But I'm also not seeing security coming in and putting the hammer down on us.
Yeah, I think it absolutely needs to be a culture change, and I felt a bit chagrined when you pointed out that when I rattled off the stages of product management, I didn't mention security, and I work in a security division. The reason I didn't do it is because it is so ingrained in me that it didn't occur to me to call it out as a separate line item, because for me and for my division. And really, I think for all of Microsoft, that is so ingrained in us, and it has been for so many years that it happens. It happens at every stage of the development cycle. If your organization is not there, if you have not yet built that culture, it needs to. Saying it needs to start at the top down is a bit of a cop-out. It needs to start at the top, but it also needs to start at the bottom. And I think they, at some point, need to meet in the middle. You need to have the Bill Gates level famous memorandum of we are stopping all new product development for 18 months to go and focus on security. Those of us who are old enough to remember that memo. But you also need to have, to your point about the REST API developers who are now coming out of school and not thinking about security, how do we get them to think about security? And how do we get that individual person checking in that individual line of code to think about security? At that point, that gets down to your individual team managers, your Scrum teams, your people who are running your individual development teams, making sure that at that micro level, it is a checklist. It is a line item on your checklist until it doesn't need to be anymore, until it becomes that ingrained.
Gotcha. And how do you make that fast? Because we're always being pressured to get stuff out I mean, so there's two things. It's cultural, but also it's speed to market. It's always speed to market, right? Is it going to be?
So at a certain point, you do need to fall back on it's easier to build it right than it is to fix it later.
I totally agree.
And building it right can encompass building it securely.
Perfect. Thank you.
But it is that trade-off, though. I do think that this is one of the areas where it is a radio button, where if you want it really fast, and certainly we've got all these different competing priorities, right? We want it done quickly, we want it done cheap, and we want it secure. You know, if we want it secure too, it's probably going to cost a little more, and it's going to take a little more time. But Laura, to your point, there'll be a lot less fixing and beta, customer beta testing, which I think a lot of every industry now makes the customer the beta tester. I'm not a fan of that. But if you're a CISO in any large organization, I've never seen a CISO that's successful as a hammer. A CISO is really a chief security evangelist in an organization. You work with the product managers, you work with internal audit, you work with the COO and CFO to evangelize why security matters, what are the business risks we're trying to mitigate. And oftentimes, partnering with audit helps because compliance initiatives oftentimes can drive security when it's an economic externality and your company may or may not have decided to prioritize it appropriately because it's other people's data.
Well, I like the top-down approach, by the way, because as long as those VPs are calculating their bonus, we're being pressed to get it out fast.
Incentives matter. They drive behavior. Absolutely.
So ideally, you would have perfect education across all those groups, but because that we live in an imperfect world, that's the opportunity that the access gateways, the layer 7s, ping access, et cetera, of the world, that's where they're finding niches in trying to separate the responsibility between the API developer and the security departments and, the old rationale for why you want to use XACML. You don't. There is, there are possibilities to try and use some newer ways to try and separate the responsibilities. I still think that you have to engage in the education, but it may be that the people who are responsible for the security of an API might not be the people who are responsible for the actual data, et cetera. So there may be opportunities to sort of divide up some of the responsibilities, and we're seeing lots of people trying to take those routes.
Awesome. Well, I think we're out of time, so I'd like to thank everybody in the audience for the great interactive session. I want to thank my esteemed panel as well.